A lot of countries, many companies have seen the writing on the wall for some time. And whether it was because of COVID-19 disruptions or Trump or now the Biden grants, whatever it happened to be, the descent into self-centered nationalism. People have been stepping back. Labor costs are a significant piece of that too, with different speeds, from different starting points, with different exposures. But the writing on the wall has been recognized by everyone in the international business community, with the exception of Apple. Now, about a year ago, Apple did start relocating, or maybe a year and a half ago, now did begin relocating, like the AirPods manufacturing to Vietnam. And that was the first product that they had that they actually decided maybe we shouldn't put it all in China. So they are the last company to come to the conclusion that there might be an issue. Now, in Apple's defense, the very concept of globalization is underpinned by the American security order. And the Americans have never completely abandoned it. It's just been a gradual retreat. But now that it's more evident, and now that the Biden administration is formalizing Trump's policies, and now that labor costs in China are so high, and now that the Chinese government is actually making it a crime for private companies to own data, that's a new development this month. That was intriguing. Apple is realizing that maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't have 91% of our supply chain steps tied to China in some way. No matter how quickly they move at this point, they can't relocate quickly enough, because an iPhone is much like a car in the sense that if you miss one of those components, you end up with a paperweight. That's correct. Most vehicles sold in the United States are 85% manufactured domestically. So, as you near the final steps, there's already a support system in place in the United States, and to a lesser extent in Canada and Mexico. There's nothing like that with Apple. They would need to reconstruct the entire ecosystem, which would take a minimum of 5 years. It's hard to say that Jinping has much authority due to the lack of information. He definitely has the power to shut things down. But he might not be able to assist Tim Cook, because that would mean going against the demographic and strategic realities of the country, not to mention Jinping's own personal standing. Cook has expressed his desire to leave, but it's important to remember that we're dealing with a Chinese leader who grew up during the Cultural Revolution. If, for the low price of a famine, strategic defeat, and deindustrialization, he can maintain his grip on power, he may consider it acceptable. So, the kind of leverage that Apple would typically have with a normal country doesn't exist here. This was probably a conversation among individuals who were each dealing with their own issues and understood that the person across the table couldn't do much to assist them. It's all about the potential for chaos, and there's plenty of that. There's one slightly less bleak aspect to this situation. Most Foxconn facilities, for the most part, are assembly facilities rather than manufacturing facilities. This means that of those 91% of supply chain steps, many of them involve different components that come to China, get assembled into another part, which is then shipped out and integrated into another part, and so on. So, assembly, while a critical part of the manufacturing process, is somewhat simpler, not necessarily easy but simpler, to relocate elsewhere. The problem we'll face, not just with iPhones and cellular devices, but with electronics in general, is that for the past 20 years, the Chinese have provided the labor force for the assembly process, rather than opting for automation mainly because there were ample numbers of workers, and the dirty environment permitted them to be located close to manufacturing facilities. If we lose this, there's no single location anywhere else in the world with a comparable number of skilled workers at scale. India lacks the quality control, and these workers aren't all in the same infrastructure. Mexican workers are too skilled. So, we'll have to approach assembly differently than we have in the past. I'd caution you before shorting China that for you to profit from the short, the other side must survive. Throughout history, most stock markets have eventually gone to zero. The luxury of shorting only existed in the globalized era. We may be returning to a slightly older system, which also involves demographics. How so? As you get older, you accumulate more wealth, and your consumption patterns change. In your 20s and 30s, you're buying homes, raising kids, and your income is relatively low, so you need to borrow. There are many people in their 20s and 30s, capital tends to be scarce. But once you reach about 45 and start thinking about retirement, and your kids move out, you've likely already purchased a home, and you might upgrade your car. but it won't have as significant an impact on the economy as buying your first car. Plus, you're likely to start considering downsizing. So you're essentially negative for the housing market, but your income is at its peak. Societies with more people in their mid-40s through their early 60s tend to be capital rich, which leads to lower borrowing costs, including interest rates across the board.